The great thing about Academic IELTS is that you already know what vocabulary you will need in writing Task 1. There is no other part of the IELTS test where you can be so sure that the vocabulary you are learning will be useful in the actual test. In this lesson, not only will you learn to describe every aspect of this chart, you will also learn enough synonyms so that you don't need to repeat yourself in your Task 1 answer. My name is Lara Ryan. I've been an IELTS examiner. I've been an IELTS teacher at the British Council. I have over a decade of experience helping IELTS students achieve success, and I am the founder of Complete Test Success. One aspect of getting a high lexical resource score is that you don't repeat yourself over and over again, and this is why I'm going to teach you so many ways to say the same thing in this lesson. To get started, we're just going to look at the basics, but this lesson will get more and more detailed as we go along. Now, here's the question we will look at. The chart below shows the most popular music genres based on album sales in the United Kingdom since 1980. Now, what we want to describe is how the numbers are higher after each year. So I can use verbs like this. Increased. The number of country albums sold increased from 1980 to 2020. Alternatively, we can use the word grew, rose, climbed, or went up. Or instead of verbs, I can use nouns like this. Increase. From 1980 to 2020, there was an increase in the number of country albums sold. Or instead of increase, we can say growth or rise. And when the IELTS examiner is deciding on your lexical resource score, they will count different forms of the same word as different words. So here we have increase used as a verb and increase used as a noun, and those will be counted as two different words by the IELTS examiner. So those are the various ways to describe when the data goes up after each year. And now we will look at how to describe when they go down. And the first one is decreased. The number of pop albums sold decreased from 1980 to 2020. And then instead of using the verb decreased, we can replace that with other verbs like declined, dropped, fell, or went down. Alternatively, we can use nouns instead of verbs to describe what's happening in this chart. So here we have decrease as a noun. From 1980 to 2020, there was a decrease in the number of pop albums sold. And again, instead of the word decrease, we also have the options of using decline, drop, or fall. Keep in mind that what we've looked at so far is past simple because this is the most common tense you will need, but you will also have to be able to use these in various tenses as well. I actually do have a grammar lesson for Academic Task 1 coming up next week, so make sure that you click subscribe or like so that you don't miss that. Now, the trend isn't always going to go up or down, sometimes it will be flat. So let's look at how to describe a category when the number stays the same each year. So this time we're looking at hip hop, and we can say stayed at the same level. The number of hip hop albums sold stayed at the same level from 1980 to 2020. Alternatively, we can say was constant, remained stable, or remained unchanged. Now, in the real IELTS test, you'll never get a category that remains stable like this for the entire period. What you will get is a category that remains stable for maybe 2 or 3 years, and that's when you will use this language. And then there are categories that will go up and down as each year passes. This is what we call fluctuations. To describe these, we can say the number of people studying fluctuated from 1980 to 2020, or from 1980 to 2020, there were fluctuations in the number of people studying. So that there is the most basic language you will need to describe the various changes that categories undergo in a graph. If you've discovered even one new word so far, please click like so that other students can find this lesson as well. Next, we're going to look at how we can describe these changes in more detail. Now, typically when we want to describe these things in more detail, we will use adverbs or adjectives. But before I actually show you these words, I need to make sure you understand the difference between amount and rate. Let's look at amount first. So if we look at country music in 1980 and 2020, we will see that the difference between these 2 years is about 40 million. So that is the amount that the sales of country albums has increased. For dance music, the amount is about 20 million, and for classical music, the amount is about 10 million. And that's basically what amount is. It's the size of the increase or the decrease. Now let's look at rate. And rate is all about the angle between one category and the next. By this, I mean angles like this. 90 degrees, 45 degrees, 30 degrees, and so on. Now, don't worry, this is not a mathematics test. You'll never need to know the exact angle. You'll just describe this in a more general way. So here are the same three categories again. Let's look at the different rates at which these increase. Country increased at a big rate, dance increased at a medium-sized rate, and classical music increased at a small rate. So, why do we need to know the difference between amount and rate? Well, there are some graphs where you can see the amount of change and the rate of change, but there are other graphs where you can only see the amount. So this is the bar graph that we've been looking at, and we can definitely see the amount and the rate of change in this one. Next, let's look at this line graph. This X shows where country was in 1980, and this one shows where it was in 2020. So between these two X's, we can see that the amount of change was about 40 million. And we can also see the rate at which this category increased. However, when we look at a table like this one, we cannot actually see the rate of the increases or decreases. We can still see that country music increased from 60 to 100 million, so the amount can be seen, but there is nowhere to actually see the angle of this increase. And these pie charts are the same. We can see the amount of change, but we cannot see the rate at which they have increased or decreased. Now, the reason that you need to know all of this is because the adverbs and the adjectives we're about to learn are based on either amount or rate. The ones for amount can be used with any chart, but the ones for rate can only be used with bar graphs and line graphs, such as the ones we just looked at. First, let's look at the ways we can describe a big amount of change. So the adverbs are dramatically, substantially, significantly, or considerably, and I'll just read an example with the first one. The number of country albums sold decreased dramatically from 1980 to 2020, and all of these have the same meaning. Now let's look at the adjectives: dramatic, substantial, significant, or considerable. From 1980 to 2020, there was a dramatic increase in the number of country albums sold. Next, we'll look at when there is a medium amount of change. We can use the adverbs modestly or moderately, so the number of dance albums sold increased modestly from 1980 to 2020. Or we have the adjectives modest or moderate. From 1980 to 2020, there was a modest increase in the number of dance albums sold. And that brings us to when there is a small amount of change. We can use the adverbs slightly or marginally. So the number of classical albums sold increased slightly from 1980 to 2020, or the adjectives slight and marginal. From 1980 to 2020, there was a slight increase in the number of classical albums sold. So those are the ones for amount, and now we'll look at the ones for rate. So when the rate is big, we can say steeply or rapidly. The number of country albums sold increased steeply from 1980 to 2020. Or we have the adjectives steep and rapid. From 1980 to 2020, there was a steep increase in the number of country albums sold. Now, when the rate of change is medium-sized, we actually won't describe this. Because we are giving general descriptions of the rate, we will just do this when it's obviously big or obviously small. So what that means is we don't have any adverbs or adjectives to describe this one, and we can move on to when the rate is small. We have the adverbs gradually and slowly. The number of classical albums sold increased gradually from 1980 to 2020. Or we have the adjectives gradual and slow. From 1980 to 2020, there was a gradual increase in the number of classical albums sold. And of course, this vocabulary isn't only used to describe increases. In the same way, it can be used to describe decreases. So here are all the adverbs and adjectives we already looked at in the context of decreasing. If you'd like to read these, please pause the video because we've already looked at all the language in these examples, so I'm not going to read them out. So in the examples we've looked at so far, the rate of change has been the exact same from year to year. Now there are words to describe this, but there are also words to describe when the rate changes significantly. So first I'll describe what happened between 1980 and 1990. Now, when there are just 2 years like this, there will never be anything significant about the rate. So I will just say, the number of folk albums sold increased by about 3 million from 1980 to 1990. Now, if we compare the rate of change from 1980 to 1990 with the rate of change from 1990 to 2000, the angle is much bigger this time. So to describe this, I can say, and suddenly or sharply increased to roughly 90 million in 2000. Then the rate of decrease from 2000 to 2010 is the same as the rate from 2010 to 2020. So it's a straight line from 2000 to 2010 to 2020. So for this I can write, after that it steadily or consistently decreased until 2020. So these are all adverbs, but we do have the adjective equivalents. From 1980 to 1990, there was an increase of about 3 million in the number of folk albums sold, and there was a sudden or sharp increase to about 90 million in 2000. After that, there was a steady or consistent decrease until 2020. So we're going to look at some more vocabulary, this time for stable trends and for fluctuations. For hip-hop, you can see that the figure is the exact same for each of the years. So to describe this, we would say the number of hip-hop albums sold remained completely stable from 1980 to 2020. Then for reggae, as each year passes, it goes up and down and up and down. But it's only going up and down by a small amount each time. So to describe this, we can say the number of reggae albums sold remained relatively stable from 1980 to 2020. Or we can say the number of reggae albums sold fluctuated slightly from 1980 to 2020. And another option is from 1980 to 2020, there were slight fluctuations in the number of reggae albums sold. And that brings us to rock, and just like reggae, the figure goes up and down with the passing of each year, but this time the increases and decreases are quite big. So to describe this one, we would say the number of rock albums sold fluctuated wildly or considerably or substantially from 1980 to 2020. Or from 1980 to 2020, there were wild, considerable or substantial fluctuations in the number of rock albums sold. Now, before we look at the next point, I just want to remind you that you can get extra support from me in my free live feedback lessons, and if you're interested in joining those, you'll find a link to join in the description below. If your Task 1 question has a table like this, or pie charts like these, you're given the exact numbers, so all you need to do is copy them directly into your answer. However, for a bar chart like this, we aren't actually given the numbers. Instead, we need to look at the y-axis and estimate. So when I want to write down the number for country music in 2010, I'll look across at the y-axis and then, as best as I can, I'll guess what that number is. And in this line graph, I need to do the exact same thing. So if I want the number for country music in 2010, I look across at the y-axis and then I estimate what that number is. So like the line chart and the bar graph just there, where we don't have the exact numbers, we need to use approximations. So in this chart about the sales of metal albums, when I need to write about 1980, I will say approximately, roughly, about, or around. The number of metal albums sold in 1980 was approximately 75 million. You might be thinking that it's exactly 75, so you don't need to use this approximation language, but can you know for sure? Maybe it's 74.9. Instead of taking a risk, I'm just going to use this language instead. Next, let's look at 1990. I can use all the same vocabulary here again. The number of metal albums sold in 1990 was approximately, or roughly, or about, or around. But this time, because the number is definitely under 75, I have a few extra words that I can use instead. Almost, just below, just under, or nearly 75 million. And then for the year 2000, I can use the words that were already suitable in the first two. The number of metal albums sold in 2000 was approximately, or roughly, or about, or around. And this time, the number is definitely over 75 million, so I have a few extra options in this context as well, just above or just over 75 million. And that brings us to the very last set of vocabulary for this lesson. If you haven't clicked like or subscribe yet, it would be great if you could do that now. The words we're going to look at now are when you need to describe the future. All of the categories we have looked at so far have been based on the past, but what happens when the chart includes predictions for the future like this? The fact is, most IELTS candidates make the exact same mistake here, and they'll use the grammar tenses will or going to when they talk about future predictions. But will or going to are not appropriate for these types of predictions. Instead, you must use terms like these: is expected to, is forecast to, is predicted to, is projected to, or is shown to. And now I'll show you an example. First, I'll describe from the start of the period until now. The number of folk albums sold increased by about 3 million from 1980 to 1990 and suddenly increased to roughly 90 million in 2000. Since then, it has steadily decreased. And for the future prediction, I will say, and this trend is predicted to continue until 2040. And that is absolutely all the vocabulary that you need to describe any graph in Academic IELTS Writing Task 1. Let's have another look at that graph I showed you at the very beginning of this lesson. And as promised, you can now describe every aspect of this graph. Make sure to leave a comment to let me know what lessons you'd like me to make next.